Thank you, Melora. My traditional name is Chlanukthut, and I inherited that name from my dad, who was from the Sartlip tribe, which is just down the road here. And my mom was from Lapwai, Idaho, so I'm half Nez Perce, half Coast Salish. And that's how we introduce ourselves, and I'd like to welcome you to the Coast Salish unceded territory. The Sartlip, where I'm from, born and raised, is just down the road, and Sartlip is just one of many tribes that make up the Coast Salish Nation, which is roughly from Comox down over in the Vancouver area and northern part of Washington State. So I welcome you all to our territories, and I'm glad to be here. I'm glad Raven asked me to come and say a few words, so thank you very much. I'll hand the mic back over to Melora.
I need this step. Virgil didn't need this step. Thank you, Virgil. Thank you for your kindness. I remember when we were chatting last time, that was the thing that struck me the most, is the gift of your kindness. I really appreciate that. And most of all, I appreciate your presence here. I know it is no small thing. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reverend Melora Lingood. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a settler of European heritage, Czech and Polish on one side, English, Scottish, Irish on the other side. Along with my wife, Shauna Lingood, I serve as co-minister of this Unitarian Universalist congregation. Welcome to those of you who have not been here before, in person or online. Unitarian Universalism, also known as UU, is a progressive faith with no creed. Our members hold many different spiritual beliefs. We include theists, agnostics, atheists, and much, much more. We have many different beliefs. What holds us together are our shared values, including respect for the inherent worth and dignity of each person, and respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. Out of those two values comes our commitment to justice and equity. This event is being co-sponsored by our Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation group, which includes members of this congregation as well as members of our sibling congregation in town, Capital Unitarian Universalist Congregation. One of the things that we've learned in this group is that one of the most effective things we can do toward reconciliation is to support Indigenous-led initiatives. I heard that there's a chance that Carl Olson might be attending today. Carl, are you here? No? Okay, that's fine. As many of you know, Carl Olson is the Sartlip elder who has been leading a protest every Tuesday morning for a year now to protect the salmon and the trees and the treaty rights that are endangered by the proposed road work at Goldstream Park. Thanks to Denise Nadeau in the back there for connecting us to that work. For you folks, and anyone else really actually, if you haven't been yet and you would like to find out more about supporting Carl Olson and his work, feel free to talk to Gayla. Gayla, where are you? There in the back, standing with the purple hat, who plans to be there most weeks now. So you can connect with her if you want to know more about that. Thank you to Carl Olson for letting us join him in that important work. And now we get to my main thank you for today. I feel grateful to Raven on multiple levels. First of all, thank you, Andrea and Leslie Ann, for being here, for your time, for your presence, and for gifting us with your knowledge. In our UU community, we have done some work learning about the devastation of colonization, both the history and the ongoing damage of its continuing legacy. And we've done some learning about Indigenous lives and culture and land. And there are a couple of folks here who have studied Indigenous law and understand some of the legal battles that Indigenous people are fighting across Turtle Island. But I'll speak for myself, the legal stuff is a bit baffling for me. So I really appreciate that you, who understand it so well, are willing to spend some time helping us learn more. So my first thank you is for the education that we are about to receive. Secondly, and most importantly, thank you for doing this world-changing work, for building a system that so directly addresses environmental and Indigenous justice, an organization that works at undoing some of the harm to this land and its people done by settlers like me and my people. And lastly, thank you for inviting us to support this work. A lot of settlers like me want to do good, but in the face of the complexity of it all, are not sure how. This is one concrete way we can support good work. Thank you for the opportunity.
Kwekwe, Leslie-Ann Nadijnakas, Makwa Dodam, Kitchissippi Valley, Nadonjaba. Hi, my name is Leslie-Ann Saintamore. I am currently the campaigns director with Raven. Prior to that, I was a lawyer in private practice. I'm a member of the Bonnechere Algonquin First Nation, which is based in Ontario. And where I want to start today is with what I like to call trying to get us all on the same page. Because I know with this topic, for a lot of folks, there's a lot of jargon and words that get thrown around that we don't often get an explanation of. And sometimes it can be hard to find somebody to ask what they mean or to even know who to ask or what to be asking. And so I'm really going to start at a really base level because I want to ensure that anybody in the room with us in person or on Zoom has an opportunity to ensure that they can understand and be part of the conversation. So for folks who I'm starting a little bit too basic, I apologize, but hold on with me. I promise it's worth it. The first thing I want to start with is First Nations, Inuit, Métis. Who are they? Why are there different names? This is something I get asked a lot. I'm a First Nations person, but I'm also of mixed settler and First Nations ancestry. This does not make me Métis. The Métis are a unique nation that did arise when First Nations were living and having children with settler men, primarily at that time French and Scottish, in certain areas of the country, primarily Manitoba and Northern Ontario, and a little bit further west and around the Red River. The Métis developed their own language, their own culture, their own ways of being, and are their own nation. There are an incredible number of First Nations across the country and different nations. I'm a member of the Algonquin Nation, and as you may have heard, I also said I'm a member of the Bonnechere Algonquin First Nation. First Nations can also sometimes be used to refer to specific communities. That's not a traditional way of referring to ourselves. That's a legacy of colonial government and colonial decisions that separated larger nations into specific bands under the Indian Act. And these bands now often will use the term First Nations to describe themselves as a specific First Nations community or government. But that's not to be mixed up with a larger nation. A nation can have many First Nations within their nation. The Inuit are another distinct nation of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and they are in the north, and they've had a different experience with colonialism than the Métis or the First Nations in some ways, very similar in others. And they have a very distinct culture, way of being, and it's both this distinct culture and way of being as well as different interactions as part of colonialism that led to them being classified, again, a little bit differently by the colonial government and not putting them under that First Nations blanket term. The other word I want to talk about that sometimes people are afraid to ask about is the word Indian. I think most of us know that it's generally not appropriate to refer to somebody who is First Nations or Indigenous as an Indian. If you don't know them, if you don't have their permission, there are some folks who still use that term about themselves and their community, and they're entitled to do that. But if you aren't of that group or of that community, it's generally not recommended. But it's still a legal term that exists. The Indian Act is still present and still dictates who is or is not legally an Indian. And the legal classification of whether or not you're an Indian can still have a really big impact on an Indigenous person's life. It can dictate where they can live. It can dictate whether they access federal health care or provincial, which can lead to all kinds of complications if you want to do something as simple as go to the emergency room. It can also dictate where your children can live, depending on whether your spouse is a status Indian as well. And so while it's not generally an appropriate term to use to describe somebody, it is an important term to understand when you're doing this work because it does still have a legal meaning and have an impact on people within this sphere. And it's really important to remember that it's still the federal government who has control over that definition of Indian. And it's still a definition that, by design, will lead to there being no more legal Indians. The way it currently works is that if you are a status Indian, depending on which, for lack of a better term, class of status Indian you are, you can maybe pass your status down onto your children if you have children with somebody who is not a status Indian, but sometimes you can't. And that's based on whether or not you had two parents who were, if both your parents were status Indians, you can pass on your status to your children regardless of your partner's status. But if only one of your parents had status, you generally cannot pass your past status on to your child. And that can mean your child can't live in the same community you can, access the same health care you can, and all kinds of different things. This is a really big simplification of something that is a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork, but it's important to remember that these are definitions that aren't within a community or a nation's control. While some communities can allow or change their laws to make room for members who are non-status to live in their community, some can't. For logistical reasons, if they don't have enough housing, or financial reasons, because they don't receive funding to support members who are non-status who live in their community. And just like a municipality receives money from the provincial government in order to sustain services, it gets very challenging to provide services if you have more people there than you're receiving funding for. And so that's a really important thing to remember when we talk about these issues, because there are a lot of really important decisions that are still being kept out of the hands of the nations themselves. When it comes to the terms Indigenous and Aboriginal, generally the preferred term is Indigenous, and a big part of that is as part of the larger international community building amongst Indigenous nations. That was a more universal term that more Indigenous nations were adopting and have taken and moved forward with as the preferred term. You'll still see Aboriginal used. It's generally not inappropriate, but it's generally not the preferred term. One thing I would suggest always avoiding is remembering that we're not Canada's Indigenous people. We were here long before Canada. We're the Indigenous people in what is now Canada. We're the Indigenous people who live within the borders of Canada, but we're not Canada's. We don't belong to Canada. Another few words I wanted to talk a little bit about are reconciliation and decolonization. These are also words that are sometimes thrown around a little bit like buzzwords. especially right now, reconciliation. When we talk about reconciliation in this context, a lot of it originated with actually a report called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was done in the 90s. And it focused on the idea of needing to find a way for Indigenous and settler ways of being, laws, and nations to meet in the middle and find a way to move forward together. But we need to remember that in theory, requires a bit of giving up on both sides. And the way we see reconciliation often moving forward is with this idea of simply bringing in more Indigenous people into spaces, which is great, but if we're not actually making space for Indigenous ways of being, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous laws, that's not really reconciliation. It's just forcing Indigenous people into settler spaces. And so we need to remember with this that reconciliation really does also require a compromise on the part of the settler and creating genuine spaces for Indigenous laws and ways of knowing. Decolonization is another word that gets thrown around a lot and gets equated with reconciliation quite a bit. But what decolonization, to me at least, really means is the idea of rolling back the project of colonization in certain places. It means rolling back settler authority over, for example, decision-making on certain parts of land or in certain types of land, and returning that jurisdiction to Indigenous peoples. There is a really great article by the author, Eve Tuck, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it talks about how we have consistently used decolonization as this buzzword for just bringing in Indigenous ideas or bringing in Indigenous peoples without doing the work of also rolling back the settler laws, the settler ways of being, and the settler expectations. And so I really encourage you to be really deliberate and conscious in how you use these words to give them meaning and to ensure that you're actually putting the meaning of what these words can be and what they should be into your actions. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is getting into a little bit of the weeds of the legal realm, but I promise is important and I promise will come up again. The idea of Aboriginal law and its differences with the idea of Indigenous law. As Raven is an organization that works with nations that are engaged in the court system, we often help people understand these differences and understand the different legal systems that we engage with. Generally, Aboriginal law is understood as the colonial law about Indigenous people. We still use the term Aboriginal law because in our Canadian Constitution, in Section 35, which recognizes and affirms the rights of Aboriginal people, that's the term that's used there. And so it is still a legal term, it's still a term that's used, and that refers to the law around the duty to consult, Aboriginal rights under Section 35, things like that. Indigenous laws are unique to every nation because every nation across what is now Canada had their own laws. They have their own legal orders, and they are working to continue to enforce them. They're working to continue to translate them into a means that Canadian courts hopefully will begin to recognize. But we were not lawless nations. We had laws, and we continue to have these laws and continue to exercise them. And when we talk about Indigenous laws in the court systems or wanting to support nations in enforcing their Indigenous laws, it's about their laws. It's not the colonial laws about them. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the legal movement that Raven has become a part of. Since contact with settlers, Indigenous nations have been asserting and reasserting and fighting for their land and their rights. There was never a time when we stopped. There were many times we were not heard. There were many times we were ignored and oppressed, but we have never stopped fighting. And while often today we talk about Indigenous rights as being a more recent appearance in the court systems and in the common discourse, a lot of these cases have bases long before even the Constitution, which included Section 35. For example, the first modern treaty came about because of a court decision in the 1970s, and that was the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, in which the Cree of Ayuichi received an injunction from the courts of Quebec about a hydro project that was going to be put forward in Northern Quebec. That agreement was the first modern treaty and the first agreement that recognized the rights that the Cree had in their territory. In addition, there was the case in BC, the Calder case from the Nisga'a Nation, which also recognized a right to title for the nations here, even before any constitutional recognition of Aboriginal rights. Section 35 did come about, and it was also not an easy battle. It became a bit of it was a political challenge to get the politicians of all the provinces and the federal government to agree to this inclusion. It became a negotiating point for other provinces to get what they wanted, and it was a hard-fought battle, and it was a big step, but it was not perfect. As I said, Section 35 recognizes and affirms the rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada, and these peoples are the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit. Unfortunately, we didn't really define it any further than that with the Constitution, and left it to the courts to figure out, as we so often do in Canadian law. And I like to think they've done their best, but we've had some decisions that have led to problems and have led to challenges. One aspect of this is the current test to define an Aboriginal right, often called the Van der Peet test, because that was the case where it was first decided, has led to this sense that our rights are frozen in time. Because to establish a right to something, we have to show it was something we were doing pre-contact, and that it was something integral to our distinctive culture. Except nations change, people change, the world has changed incredibly since that time. And so courts have been reluctant to allow our rights to develop with time as well, because there's this idea of if we weren't doing it at contact, it can't be a right. But none of us are doing things exactly the way we were at contact, and that shouldn't be a reason that we can't continue to exercise our rights in the ways they make sense in today's world. Another challenge that has been set up for us with the courts has been, because it's focused on actions that were integral to a distinctive culture, the idea of self-government and a right to make decisions over ourselves, over our people, has been a struggle. Because it's hard to argue governing yourself is distinctive to your culture when everyone governs themselves in their own ways. It's not distinctive anymore. And so the courts have been really reluctant to consider a Section 35 right to self-government. There's case law that says that it does not exist, and it's in part because of the way that test has been set up by the courts that makes it so hard to demonstrate. We got a little bit of hope in this realm recently with the Supreme Court decision on the reference for Bill C-92, which came out a couple of weeks ago now, in which the court found that the federal government did, through legislation, create a right to self-government over child welfare systems, in which we hope this is a bit of an opening, but they did not ground that right in Section 35, which means it may not be open still for nations to bring forth that argument and show that they have that right. And I hope that the courts will move forward with this opening and we won't have to continue to rely on legislation from the federal government, but it's an unanswered question. The other aspect I want to talk about is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was originally adopted by many nations across the world in 2007. There were four who were against that adoption at that time. There were several that abstained, there were some who weren't there, but the only four who voted against it were Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. I wonder why. Eventually, Canada has apparently come around to supporting the UN Declaration. And I say apparently because in 2015, they did start to speak about adopting the Declaration. In 2020, there was legislation that's meant to bring Canada's laws in line with the Declaration. But if you look at what's still going on in Canada, I don't think we're really there yet. One of the major aspects of the UN Declaration that was so controversial for Canada and so challenging was the idea of letting Indigenous peoples have free, prior, and informed consent on what happens on their land. There was a fear that this would give Indigenous peoples a veto over what happens on land. And there's different ways you can implement what they call FPIC, this idea of consent. There's different ways it's been conceptualized as to whether or not it actually means a veto, whether or not it just means negotiations that are done in good faith and come to some sort of agreement, even if it's not 100% everyone's happy. But, well, one, would a veto be so bad? Because if you think about it, the federal and provincial government, they have a veto over what happens on their land in a lot of ways. If we want to be serious about reconciliation or decolonization or recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, would a veto be that out of line? I don't think so. But the other aspect of this that concerns me, and this is something that we're seeing right now, is on the one hand, a couple weeks ago with that C-92 decision, the Supreme Court did find that because of the way Canada passed its UNDRIP law, that UNDRIP has been incorporated into domestic law and that courts do need to take it into account. But then you look in BC, who also passed a version of an UNDRIP law, and who in the courts just last year walked back most of it and argued that it was just symbolic, it was just a guideline, and that it didn't actually have any teeth, that it wasn't an enforceable law. And so how can we rely on international tools like this when governments can decide how they want to interpret them, how they want to implement them at any given time? I think it becomes really challenging to rely on these tools, but at the same time, in no way do I want to discount the work and the talent and the effort that went into its negotiation by Indigenous peoples across the world. It is a great feat and it's very important. I just don't like the disrespect that it's shown in Canada and the way it's been used and implemented. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about something that's been in the news recently in BC, which is the proposed amendments to the BC Lands Act, which folks may have heard about. And this was personally very frustrating to me because I saw this play out amongst other lawyers. And a lot of the misinformation should never have been put out there, and it didn't have to be put out there. The amendments to the Lands Act that were proposed were part of bringing that act in alignment with BC's UNDRIP Act, and was part of a roadmap to implementation that had been put out back in 2022, I believe, and was no surprise. Everyone in government knew it was coming. It was part of commitments they'd already made, promises they'd already made. Things were just moving along as they should in government. But people who weren't engaged on these issues and people who didn't understand that those amendments were part of this larger project put forward some public opinions about them. They put forward this idea that this was giving Indigenous nations control over what happens on Crown land, that it was changes to the tenure system in BC, when really it was changing the act to allow the province to be able to negotiate decision-making agreements. They weren't giving up a right to decision-making. It was giving them the ability to start a conversation of saying, how can we work together? But people put forward ideas about this act without understanding that context and engaged in a bit of fear-mongering. And that was picked up by politicians who wanted to use this for political purposes and who wanted these amendments to not move forward as a way to garner support for themselves and their parties, as well as by stakeholders and industry groups who thought this was an opportunity to push back on decisions that had already been made by government many years ago with the passing of DRIPA and passing of that roadmap. And I think it's really unfortunate, and I think it's really important that this is why everyone try to understand these issues and try to engage with them, because this didn't have to happen. I'd like to think that some of the people who put out first assessments, particularly the lawyers who put out first assessments of what could these amendments mean, didn't mean to start this fear-mongering. They just didn't understand the context of what they were writing about. They just looked at those amendments out of context. This is why it's so important that we have this understanding of the history and the context to be able to ensure that we're holding decision makers and people in positions of power to account. Because BC should not be able to just walk back the idea of moving forward with these amendments. They'll just walk back upholding their commitments under their DRIPA Act because they didn't communicate it well. And I worry that now many nations who are ready to start engaging in these decision-making committees and negotiate decision-making on their land are now having to wait again for who knows how long, or will they turn back to the courts because they were told negotiations were possible and those were just walked back. I think, and this is just me speculating, I think we will see nations that are forced to go back to court over issues that could have been dealt with through negotiations because of the rollout of these amendments and the walking back of them. And I think it's a waste of nations' resources and, quite frankly, BC's resources when it could have been resolved cheaper and easier through negotiations, and that's really unfortunate. With this, the last thing I want to touch on is the idea of Landback. Landback is often a phrase thrown around in a lot of these conversations around jurisdiction for land. And it's often used in this fear-mongering in a way of people saying, what, do they want us all to leave? Do we have to give up our private land? Most Indigenous people are going to tell you that's not what we mean by land back. We want the ability to make decisions over what happens within our territories. We want the ability to protect our land and uphold our laws and our obligations to our territories and our land. It's much more about jurisdiction rather than any kind of eviction. And I think it's something that we need to start taking seriously, because I think the courts are starting to recognize that Indigenous peoples have title, we have rights, and unless they want to keep fighting in the courts for years and years, taking seriously these ideas of co-jurisdiction and co-management are really important. And with that, that is where I will end, and I will pass things over, but thank you. I hope I made the legal system a little more clear.
Thank you so much, Leslie Ann. It's really rare that you get a lawyer who can generalize and make things understandable in such a vibrant way and such a personal way. So thank you so much for your candor and your incredible knowledge. I've been working with Raven for 10 years, and I just learned a heck of a lot. So my name is Andrea Palferman, and I work as Raven's communication director. I'm a settler. My ancestry is Irish and Scottish. These are my grandmas on my hands here. And I just returned this morning from Terrace, BC. I was visiting with Gitxaala Nation and leaders from the Wet'suwet'en. And I met these incredible leaders who are pushing for mining justice, who are pushing for the implementation of DRIPA, who are pushing for a transition away from fossil fuels and enshrining the right to a safe climate into law. I met with this matriarch named Antoinette Austin, who was a school teacher and a Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief, who, when she spoke about bringing young children out on the land to learn their culture,
spoke about the powerful connecting she fosters, and she called it a means of occupying our hearts and decolonizing our minds. Such a resonant statement, and thank you so much for laying the groundwork for us to understand that decolonizing is not a catchphrase and even a metaphor. It's a process that we all go through, because colonialism hurts everyone. It's really hurt Indigenous peoples. But the colonizers are also bearing wounds, and we need to heal, all of us. So environmental campaigning and in the media, there's a lot of time spent where we say no to things. So we say no to reckless industry and no to taking down old growth and no to pipelines. But when I spent time on the land with these matriarchs and hereditary chiefs, they really took care to show the beauty of their territories and share the responsibility they carry to uphold Indigenous law, like, as Leslie-Anne described, law that has existed for thousands of years, and these responsibilities have been passed from person to person. And I got to witness what Indigenous people are saying yes to. And really, this is a world that many of us want to live in. So that's the world I want to live in too, and that's why I'm doing this work. I also have 2 kids who have recently traced their family lineage back through to the Red River, thanks to their Auntie Janice, so they're Métis people. I got more involved in the work, I guess, of what you could call like reconciliation, when a Calgary joke shop tycoon bought a little island in Ganges Harbor off of where I live. It's the island of Chuan, also known as Salt Spring. And this person proceeded to get permits to build their house directly on top of a known Indigenous gravesite. And elders from Cowichan and Sartlip and Sawit and Penelakut and Wasanic nations all came together to protest this gross injustice. And just to kind of show the racism and disconnect, some of the people who were part of the Save Grace Island movement went to Oak Bay Cemetery with a big house, and they planted it amongst the graves, just to kind of express the double standard that was being applied and the gross disrespect. And thanks to the Indigenous leadership, that place was ultimately protected, and those graves are intact as they can be after a summer of somebody trying to build a house there. So that was an incredible wake-up call about like how far we still have to go. It brought a lot of relationship to the forefront, because a lot of the people who traditionally had lived and their ancestors had used Salt Spring Island and stewarded Salt Spring Island came and started to make friends and started to reclaim the land. And that process is still ongoing. So that was my introduction, but at the same time, nations from across BC were joining forces to push back against a much larger threat, which was a pipeline that would bring tar sands from Alberta across the Skeena watershed to be piped onto tankers and shipped past the homelands of Gitxaala, Heiltsuk, Haida, and dozens of other nations. This was the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. So that was how I joined Raven, with the Pull Together campaign that ultimately raised $1 million for Indigenous-led court case that ended up quashing the Northern Gateway pipeline. So fast forward a decade, and Raven is going strong. We've partnered with nations in the Yukon to protect hundreds of thousands of hectares of land in the Peel watershed. Recently joined with 10 Ontario nations in a place known as the Breathing Lands, which is this huge carbon storehouse, as significant to the health of our planet and our atmosphere as the Amazon rainforest. We've stood with Beaver Lake Cree Nation and continue to stand with them, whose historic Defend the Treaties trial aims to force industrial projects to be evaluated not one at a time, but according to their collective cumulative impacts on the treaty rights to hunt, fish, gather, and practice culture. Marion Pape is here, and she's kindly offered to pass a basket to collect donations. So part of this whole conversation about putting reconciliation into action is really about ways that people can get involved and recognizing that not everybody has the financial means to get involved. I want to talk about some of the different ways that you can participate with Raven. Our mission is quite simple, but there is a reason why we chose Raven as our namesake. For in Northwest Indigenous stories, ravens are tricksters who take on work that is often overlooked, and in doing so, they reshape and transform the world. So, as Leslie Ann so poignantly expressed, it should not be up to Indigenous nations to hold Canada accountable to its own laws, its own commitments. And yet that's what's happening. And very often, the nations are in court thanks to our tax dollars. Your money is being spent, whether you like it or not, fighting Indigenous nations in court. And the government has very deep pockets. And so one element of the trickster that Raven is because we're a registered charity, we give tax receipts. So you can offset the money that automatically goes to fighting Indigenous people in courts by donating to Raven and supporting Indigenous nations as they take a stand for, yes, their own rights, but really for future generations, really for the benefit of all of us, to have a safe and healthy climate and planet to pass on to our descendants. So John Borrows, who held the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law and is also part of Raven's legal advisory panel, so it's a group of brilliant lawyers who kind of help determine which cases we take on to support. He talks about law as a verb. So law is not something that happens, it's something that you do. It's something we all practice. It's not practiced on our behalf. We are all agents of law. Because it puts us in relationship with one another as a way of repairing a world out of balance. So I really resonate with that as an activist, but also as a settler, wondering, do I have any business being involved in Indigenous struggles? Like, aside from the fact that we're invited to do this work through Raven by the nations, it feels worthwhile to lean into the sort of action part of reconciliation by inviting you and people to donate either once or as a monthly donor, to set up online fundraisers or to organize community events like this. We become part of an incredible movement of people in solidarity who are marching, paddling, sometimes stumbling, sometimes dancing towards a world where justice is alive and well. So I invite you to learn more about Raven at raventrust.com. There's a little QR code in the basket, but there's also a table full of materials on your way out. Please collect things and bring them and share them with people who aren't here today who might be interested in finding out how they can put reconciliation into action. And if you're on the Zoom, then please check the chat, because there'll be some links in the chat for you. So back to Antoinette Austin, whose generous ways of knowing and being with the land are, I hope, going to rub off on me and all of us. Antoinette taught me a word, snigalia, which translates to your generosity will be returned. As with the potlatch tradition, in which you show your wealth by giving it away, snigalia is the greatest form of gratitude you could receive. My experience in opening up my life to the teachings of Indigenous peoples has been so rich. Learning the laws of this land is a lifelong endeavor, and one that opens a person up to realms of wonder and responsibility that are deeply nourishing. So thank you to the Unitarians. Thank you, Virgil, for coming today. Thank you, Kathleen, for this beautiful necklace that I dropped off some pamphlets at Kathleen's house, and I walked through her door, and the necklace I was wearing, this one, fell to pieces on the floor. It's like, oh, look at that. And she very generously repaired it, and that was the beginning of our connection, which is so special. Also to Leslie Ann, thank you so much, and to Carissa Chandrakate, who is running the Zoom tonight. And also thank you all for listening, and thank you for taking the time to reflect on ways you can take what you hear today and let it seep into your life in ways that challenge you, in ways that inspire you, in ways that nourish yourself, your community, and the roots of the next world, the one we're going to make together. So, thank you, and Virgil, you're up.
Thank you, Heichka, for the speakers before me. Thank you, Laura. So thank you for the people that spoke before me. I'm not a lawyer or a politician. I'm glad I got asked to come here because this is actually really part of what reconciliation looks like. And working and talking with each other about each other. And I'm glad was asked by Raven to come here to talk. I was born and raised here, and a lot of my teachings and the talks that I do I'm repeating what was told to me by my elders, my older brothers, my aunties, my uncles, grandparents, great-grandparents. All those knowledges have been passed down, and that's how we learn. And, you know, when you think of reconciliation, and the direction that we all want to go to is to walk beside each other and learn about each other. And that's why I'm glad to be here, is I'm able to talk a little bit about myself and my people and what I've learned. These colonial laws and justice system is so different from our laws and our way of life. It really goes against the grain of who we are as a people, these laws that was forced on us. And we have to talk about talk about a little bit about history. And some of the things we talk about can be very difficult to be informed about of truth and reconciliation. Our laws, part of our laws and who we are as a people is about how we are with each other, not only as man and woman, but as our relationship and connection to the land, the sea, and the air, and all the life forms that are in the land, the sea, and the air. From the slithering creatures to the crawling creatures, the four-legged animals, the flying animals, the swimming animals, right up to us humans. We are just part of this. We are part of that lifeline. And when we first got here, so many things in our culture and our teachings are what we had to watch other life forms in this area and how these other life forms survived in this area. And a lot of those is in our songs, in our dance, and in our artwork. These artwork and designs have meanings and purposes with what we've been told on how these creatures survived here. And so that's what we had to learn, to see how they survived in this area, how the tides changed, how the climate has changed. The Mother Earth is so important to all of us. And I'm really glad that Raven is doing the work that they're doing to help us to preserve Mother Earth and all the beauty that it has in it, with all these life forms that we depend on for survival. Plants. This podium here was a tree. It had a life, just like we have life. It had a purpose. It fed us, it clothed us, it helped us travel, just from this one life form, a tree. And there's so many life forms out there that we depend on. The water, all these creatures that I do in my artwork, we depend on these things for our survival and to respect. And that's a big part of our culture, is we have respect for life forms in the land, the sea, and the air, the Mother Earth. This time of the year is a time of the year where we reaffirm ourselves with Mother Earth through song and dance. It's a very important time of the year to appreciate and acknowledge what we have, what the Creator put here for us to be part of. So that's why those are our laws, our respect for life and the life forms in the land, the sea, and the air. But when this government, this Canadian government and its laws and bureaucracy, it just kind of really went against our people and our way of life and our laws. And it's terrible how we had to, those are the things that we went through before European contact, is we were managing the resources in such a good way, thousands of years before European contact. We were managing the resources just fine. Nothing was going extinct. Nothing was close to going extinct. We were managing everything, all our resources, in an awesome way. And it's not like that anymore because of the pipelines, the mining, and development. When they approached us when they were building that highway, the Malahat Highway, we didn't want that, our people, because a lot of these areas all around here in the Southern Island are very sacred to us. We held our ceremonies there for becoming a man, becoming a woman, honoring and respecting and giving thanks to all the creatures. All kinds of ceremonies that we did, right from Oak Bay, right all the way up that way along the coast in the mountains area. We do spiritual bathing. All that we were doing before contact, and we're still doing it today. And I'm so glad that Raven has been fighting and raising money in this way, because all this belongs to all of us. We're just part of it. We need to save this, our planet and our lands, the water. Everything has a meaning and everything has a purpose, and we need to respect that. We need to respect all the life forms that are just outside these doors, just across in that pond, just across in the forest over there. All the life forms that are in there have a right to be here just as much as we have a right to be here. Something depends on something for survival, right up to us. And that's what our laws are about, is respecting that life. And I know that these things are different from other cultures than First Nations. And I'm actually glad she mentioned about, I know our people, we've been called so many things nowadays. Indigenous, First People, Indians. I don't like Indian, to tell you the truth. I like the First Nations. The reason why I don't like Indian is we were named by a lost guy. So it's kind of like, yeah, we got to change this. So Anyway, you know, that's why I'm here, you know, and that's why I like to do talks like this is truth and reconciliation. We need to have these talks. These talks are difficult. They can be difficult if it's not the way you're living. And I'm not here to impose my ways on anybody here, but I'm sharing with you what I am, where I'm from, what our beliefs and traditions are, what our laws are. Not Canadian laws. We have a respect for the life. We have a respect for the Mother Earth, and we have to preserve that. There's so many things that we need to talk about. This is just a part of it, and we only have limited time. You know, I'm glad to be asked to talk to groups like this because we have to talk about it. You have to talk about the history and what happened, what we were before, and what happened to us and where we are today. We have to talk about that. But we have similar stories. We're hurting. I found out through watching documentaries what this government and what the religions did to us and all the horrors that happened to us. The white folks were doing it to them before they did it to us. And so I had to change my way of thinking because I never used to like white people for what happened to me in the schools. I'm a survivor. And I could not dislike a person that was going through the same thing as me. And so that opened my eyes to how much hurt that's going on in the world, not only towards what we do to each other as humans, but what we're doing to the environment, what we're doing to the water, what we're doing to the air, and all those life that's in those. We're damaging it, and things are becoming, we're overfishing, we're cutting too many trees down. When those trees go, when we cut them down, it warms up the water. And it goes down, the water goes warm into the water. And then it pushes the salmon out. They don't like the cold. Or they don't like the warm. They want to be cold, so we're pushing it out. And the trees are so sacred to us. You know, there's so many things we have to honor and respect. Ferns, grass, water, each other. Women are sacred. Women make water sacred. When women are carrying us in their bellies, we're surrounded in water, and that's how water becomes sacred. Women are the backbones of our communities and our families. We absolutely love our elders. Our elders are, I'm repeating what an elder told me. I'm just repeating what someone told me. You know, and when I first met Catherine down here at an art show that was here, she asked me so many questions and was very inquisitive, and I found it kind of humorous that because she's just full of questions, and that's what it's all about, though. You know, she learned a lot, Catherine, my friend down here. You know, we absolutely love our elders because they're our encyclopedias. They're most valued in our families and our communities because they're the knowledge keepers. They're the ones that pass everything that I've just told you, pass down to each other. And that's why we value our elders so much. They're so important. And Catherine's come to a few of our events and family dinners, and she sees how we respect our elders, how we treat our elders. They're first, and we respect them the most. They're so valuable, and I'd like to see that more with different cultures, is how, you know, respect for the elders, women. So I'm really glad Catherine came and started asking me questions, and she started seeing very firsthand how our people are. She has a real inside look, from family dinners to ceremony, and then death. She's been to our funerals and what we do, the ceremonies we hold in our funerals when we lose a loved one, and our pets. You know, our pets are we love them so much too, and you know, there's so much to share, you know. And when I do talks, I normally like to have a question time where if you want to know something or curious about something, I don't have all the answers, but I can definitely steer you in the direction of someone who does. But yeah.
We talked a lot about different labels and names for people that were here before colonization. What about the word native?
Yeah, well, that's another one. That was another name besides Indian, natives, indigenous, First Peoples, saltwater people.
Is it okay word to use, or is it out of favor?
Pardon me?
Is it okay to use the word native, or is it out of favor?
That's okay. The one we don't like is Indian. Yeah. Like I said, we were named by a lost fellow. And he wasn't a very nice guy. So we really, I know myself, I don't like the term native. You know, it's, Indian. I don't like the name Indian, the term Indian. I'd rather not be called that. It's, yeah.
Thank you for being here to speak with us today. I was wondering about something that Leslie mentioned earlier when she was speaking to us about the legal and historical framework. She explained to us the distinction between First Nations and Indian lands, the colonial structures and the traditional structures. Could you give us your views of what the obstacles are for moving from the band or the First Nation structure under colonial legislation to the traditional forms of government, to the more, not necessarily original, but 21st century version of an Indigenous nation government? Oh, should I repeat my question? Okay. So I will just
make it short on what your question was.
Yeah, like really just to the nub of the question. Could you give us your views on what you think the obstacles are to moving from band councils and First Nations that exist within the Indian Act and colonial structures, moving from that as a form of governance to the traditional Indigenous Nations, 21st century version of the traditional forms of governance? What are the obstacles that you see to doing that?
The Indian Act. Yeah, the Indian Act is a huge barrier that needs to go. It is so oppressive to our people. And I just kind of my long story short on what our laws are about. But getting rid of the Indian Act would be something that would be just so nice to move beyond. But I'm only speaking for Coast Salish people in our ways, for instance, like the Haida, the Iroquois, the Mohawks, and Algonquins, they all have different traditions and language and dialects, but similar. The similarity is our beliefs and respect for the land, our connection with the land, the sea, and the air. That's where the connection is. But I think the sooner we get rid of that Indian Act would be just like so amazing. It's got to go. Yeah.
In this past year, I've become aware of a number of South Island, Vancouver Island nations participating in the Timex Treaty. And as I understand it, once it's passed, and it's not passed, once it's got all its approvals, I know the Songhees are involved, and maybe Beecher Bay, and there's 6 nations, I think. But they will be out of the Indian Act once that Timex Treaty process concludes. And I'm wondering why all of the South Island nations chose maybe not to participate in that, given the outcome being a way to get out of the treaty. And what if they really, or the Indian Act, and what if the Songhees, for example, have had to concede in order to accomplish that? Is that a fair question to ask?
I think I need to remind that I stress that I'm not a politician or a lawyer. You know, we have leaders that are more capable of answering these kinds of questions. But even then, the Indian Act, they make us vote in a chief and council. It was different before, where the heads of our families made the decisions of the community. And so it was different that way. So I have to be careful on what I say, because I might get in trouble with my people. and I like to stay out of trouble nowadays. I've been a good boy for a long time.
To be considered an elder?
I think nowadays it's kind of like around 55 and up. Yeah, so if you're below 55, you're all right. I don't know. There's, that's the thing about it is, we need to start learning about each other and treating each other in a good way, no matter who you are or where you're from. Each and every one of us here has a background. We have a lot more in common than we do that is uncommon. A lot of our, you go back to the Viking days, and you look at China, and one of the most common things that we have is drums. A lot of cultures have used drums over the years, and rattles. So we have a lot in common already. It's just we just don't know enough about each other. And that's where I believe this country went wrong, is they tried to take that away from us through the schools. But that's another topic that I'd kind of rather not get into right now, because it's such a big story. And but the schools are a difficult conversation that is needed, because we can't learn of before contact, what happened during contact and what they did to us, and then what we're doing now to preserve our ways of our culture through our songs and dance and our artwork. And that's why I was glad that Raven Trust asked me here, is because they're helping us in that area to fight this country, I guess, to preserve what we have and what we all need. It's not just my people that need the water. It's not just my people that need clean air. It's all of us do. It's not just our fight. But people point at us. Part of these talks are to clear that up and to help non-natives understand of who we are and what we are, what we belong to. And like I said, we're just part of this. We're not superior. Everybody depends on something for survival, and we're just part of this life on Earth. Yeah. So I think I'll wrap her up there. It's getting close, and I guess I'll ask Melora to come up and close things up, I guess, or someone. thank you for your time, and thank you again, Raven and Melora, for having me here. And there's so much to talk about and lots to share about each other. And we need to take action to learn the truths about not only my people, but each other. We really need to know these truths. We can't grow unless we know. So whenever you have an opportunity to ask questions, ask. You know, no matter how difficult it is, ask. That's why us survivors, we like to talk. You know, it's difficult, but it's required. Otherwise, you just won't know. You'll be just wondering. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Virgil isn't just an artist of words. He's also an artist of brush, and you'll find some of his beautiful work at the back. So if you have time to hang around and have a look at the impromptu gallery that's here, please do. I also want to draw your attention to a resource that Raven has developed online that takes a deeper dive into many of the concepts that Leslie Ann brought up today, and really was designed to give a foundational understanding of the concepts, the historical background, and the paths forward for this country. It's called homeonnativeland.com, and it features videos with 10 different brilliant Indigenous legal scholars who often wear multiple hats, so they're not all practicing lawyers. Some of them are professors, some of them are community activists, some of them, like Terry-Ann Williams-Davidson, is the lawyer for her people, the Haida people. John Burroughs is in there. And I really encourage you to check it out and just take time with it. We designed it to be less serious, maybe, than some of these resources, to try to dispel some of the fear people might have about even participating in these conversations. So there's actually quite a bit of humor, because some of it is just so absurd, you almost can't help but just bang your head and then laugh and then cry and then bang your head and then maybe walk forward. So please check out homeonnativeland.com if you want to continue to swim in these waters, and I know we all do. Thank you so much for coming today and just opening your ears, your minds, your hearts. And, you know, when it comes to those crunchier political details, hopefully you have some more grounding and also are encouraged to just, ask questions. Like seek out the knowledge by building relationships, because that's really one of the things that we were taught not to do very actively. Don't meet each other, don't hang out, don't cross the boundary into the reserve. Well, when you're invited, do go. So thanks for making the space today, everybody. We're really grateful on behalf of Raven that you were able to come, and really look forward to continuing this lovely conversation. Thank you.
There's one more thing I'd like to share is kind of good and bad, but when we were kids and we were in the residential schools and the day schools, we weren't allowed to have relationships even with our brothers and sisters and friends who we grew up with. But nowadays, a lot of our people, we do use a lot of humor, and we often say, if I stop bugging you, then you have something to worry about. God knows that. But we like to use humor in a lot of things we do, in family gatherings especially, and powwows. Come to our powwow. Forgot to mention that. On the third weekend of every July, it's called. We returned the name to our mom, who was Watanmai from Nez Perce territory. So This year will be our 29th annual, and you're all welcome. But come to the powwow and learn. You come as you are, dress as how you want. You know, wear hats. It's going to be hot third weekend of July. But you're all welcome. It's free to get in. You'll enjoy some really good cultural songs and dance. And I'll show you one example of how we dance to the Mother Earth. Is when you see guys going like this. What do you think that is? Going like this. Anybody? What do you think that is?
A bird.
It's grass in the wind. So we have a grass dance, and that's what, when you see them going like that. So that's what I mean when we have songs and dance for everything to honor the life forms in the land, the sea, and the air. So you'll see stuff like that. But my dad was from here, and we have different drumming and stuff like that. So yeah, but you're all welcome to our powwow this summer. In every one we have, anytime you see a cultural event advertised on the newspaper or the news, go to it. That's how you're going to learn. And just go ask. That's why I mentioned Catherine. She just came up and she just started asking. Couldn't keep her quiet. Yeah, thank you.